It was the kind of evening most people in town wouldn't remember. A clear sky, the last light of summer still hanging above the rooftops, and the quiet rhythm of a neighborhood settling down for the night. Families were finishing dinner, sprinklers hummed on lawns, and porch lights began to glow against the darkening streets. For one family, though, what began as an ordinary evening would mark the start of a nightmare that would stretch on for more than a decade. The girl was only 15 years old, a high school sophomore with no enemies, no obvious troubles, and no history of running away. Around 7 o'clock, she clipped the leash onto the family dog and announced she was taking him out for a short walk. Her parents thought little of it. She walked the dog nearly every evening, usually circling the same route that led past the edge of the woods before looping back into their cul-de-sac. The only unusual detail that night was how quickly darkness would fall. The days were getting shorter, and the trail she often used became cloaked in shadow long before the houses switched on their lights. Neighbors later recalled the sight of her passing by. A few saw her smile, tugging gently on the leash as the golden retriever strained ahead, eager to reach the trail. She wasn't in distress, wasn't hurried, and gave no impression of fear. To everyone watching, it looked like an ordinary walk, one she had taken countless times before. But minutes later, the ordinary shattered. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from her parents. It came from the dog. Around 8:30, a couple living near the wooded entrance spotted the retriever trotting across their yard alone. The leash was still attached, dragging through the grass, but the girl was nowhere in sight. Assuming she had simply let go and would appear any moment, they tried calling out. When no one answered, they secured the dog and knocked on doors up and down the street. Within half an hour, word reached her parents. Their daughter had not returned. At first, her family resisted panic. They assumed she had stopped to visit a friend or perhaps taken a longer loop through the neighborhood. But as minutes turned into hours, unease spread. She wasn't answering her phone. Her friends hadn't seen her. The dog had clearly broken free or been let go, and she had not come looking for him. By 10 o'clock, her parents made the call that would change everything. They dialed 911 and reported their daughter missing. What followed was a flurry of activity that felt both urgent and chaotic. Police arrived, took down her description, and began knocking on doors. Patrol cars swept the streets, their headlights cutting across yards and fences. Officers walked into the woods with flashlights, the beams darting between trees as they shouted her name. Volunteers soon joined, neighbors grabbing jackets and forming search lines that pressed deeper into the trail network. The air, filled with the sound of calling voices, barking dogs, and snapping branches. The retriever was checked for signs of struggle, blood, torn fur, anything that might suggest an attack. But nothing was found. The leash was intact, and the dog seemed anxious but unharmed. Some speculated he had simply slipped free and wandered off. Others thought the opposite, that he had bolted in fear after something happened to her. By midnight, helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping the forest floor. Search dogs were brought in and given the girl's scent from a sweater her mother retrieved from her bedroom. For a short stretch, the dogs pulled strongly toward a bend in the trail, near a shallow creek, but then their focus dissipated. Handlers described it as if the scent had simply vanished. The girl's family could only watch. Her mother stood at the edge of the woods, clutching her daughter's shoes from the front hall as if holding them would somehow anchor her back home. Her father followed officers, answering their repeated questions about where she liked to walk, who she spent time with, and whether she had been upset about anything. Each answer felt inadequate. Nothing explained why she hadn't come back. As the hours dragged toward dawn, fear began to solidify into something darker. Neighbors gathered on porches, whispering about the possibility of an abduction. Some mentioned a white truck that had been seen near the trail in recent weeks. Others suggested she might have slipped, fallen, and injured herself somewhere deep in the woods. Every theory felt possible, and yet none brought the girl back. The following morning, the town awoke to the news. Flyers were already being printed with her school photo. Reporters began arriving, their vans crowding the narrow streets. Cameras pointed at the house where her parents sat sleepless inside. Friends described her as kind, funny, and dependable. Teachers said she had been an average student with no record of skipping class or causing trouble. Nothing in her life story fits the pattern of a runaway. Within 24 hours, the disappearance of a girl who had simply walked her dog turned into the biggest investigation the small town had ever seen. Roads were blocked off, the trail system was combed again and again, and dive teams checked the nearby creek for any sign of her. Each effort ended the same way, with nothing. And so the first day closed with no trace of the missing girl. Only her dog returned home. For the family, it was as though she had stepped into the woods and been swallowed whole. The unanswered question lingered heavily over every searcher, every officer, every sleepless neighbor. If she never left the trail, then where did she go? By the time the first night gave way to morning, the case had already grown beyond the limits of the girl's neighborhood. Police expanded the search outward, going door to door, waking families from sleep, asking if anyone had seen a 15-year-old with blonde hair, a striped hoodie, and a golden retriever. Most said no. A few insisted they had glimpsed her earlier, but the times didn't align, and details blurred under questioning. Officers marked the trail entrance as a central point, stringing yellow tape across one of the footpaths and fanning out with flashlights, while volunteers gathered in clusters, waiting to be told where to walk. The woods themselves seemed endless to those who combed them. Narrow dirt paths split into dozens of branches, some looping back to the main trail, others tapering off into marshy dead ends. Searchers shouted her name again and again, their voices swallowed by thick undergrowth. A helicopter thumped overhead, its spotlight sweeping over the canopy, while ground teams struggled with the sheer size of the terrain. At dawn, bloodhounds were brought in to follow her scent, handlers explaining to the family that these early hours were critical. The dogs lunged forward eagerly at first, sniffing along the packed dirt, but after less than a mile, their behavior shifted, circling confusedly, pulling in different directions. It was as if the trail had been interrupted. The girl's parents followed every update with desperation. Her mother clung to officers, demanding to know what each change in the dog's behavior meant, while her father tried to keep her grounded, asking practical questions about the search grid. Neither could stop imagining the possibilities. Had she fallen and struck her head? Has someone intercepted her? Had she chosen to disappear? Each answer felt unbearable in its own way. By noon, the neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. Some residents repeated a story about a white van that had been parked near the trail the week before. Others claimed a drifter had been seen at a gas station several miles away, asking directions to town. Teenagers whispered that maybe she had run away to meet someone she knew online, though there was no evidence to suggest it. The police tried to rein in speculation, but in a town that had never seen a disappearance of this magnitude, people filled the void with their own theories. The first press conference took place in the afternoon, staged on the family's lawn. Detectives urged the public to remain calm while emphasizing that every resource was being used. Behind the cameras, the girl's mother broke down, pleading for her daughter to come home, while her father spoke with controlled urgency, repeating her description and promising that she would be found. The dog sat at their feet, restless and confused, pulling at the leash as though still searching for the one who held it the night before. That evening, hundreds of volunteers gathered at a local church, signing in and being assigned to search teams. Maps were spread across folding tables, and coordinators marked sectors with highlighters. Some groups were sent to sweep drainage ditches, others to check barns and abandoned sheds. At the edges of town, every car parked along the trail was logged, every license plate recorded. The scale of the operation swelled, yet as darkness fell for the second time, there was still no trace of the girl. Officers began to consider scenarios they hadn't voiced in the early hours. If she had been abducted, the critical window for rescue was closing. If she had chosen to leave, she might already be far away. The possibility that she had suffered an accident in the woods still seemed plausible. But after repeated sweeps of the main paths, the lack of evidence was troubling. No dropped phone, no torn clothing, no sign of struggle. The forest floor appeared untouched, save for the footprints of searchers. For the family, each passing hour cut deeper. Her younger brother, only 13 at the time, sat on the porch in silence, refusing to eat, staring at the woods as if waiting for her to step back out. Her grandparents arrived and tried to comfort the parents, but grief was already carving sharp edges into the household. Neighbors brought casseroles and bottled water, hovering awkwardly between sympathy and fear. Everyone understood that the longer she remained missing, the less likely she would be found unharmed. As the second day began, detectives gathered in the command post to reassess. Maps were spread across folding tables, pins marking every reported sighting. A call had come in about a girl seen near a highway rest stop 20 miles away, another about someone matching her description at a bus station. Both were checked and dismissed within hours. Officers privately admitted the case felt directionless. They had a vanished girl, a found dog, and little else. By the third day, frustration seeped through the ranks of searchers. Volunteers whispered doubts, wondering if she had ever been in the woods at all. Some speculated she had willingly left with someone she trusted. Others suspected foul play closer to home. Police began looking more intently at family members, noting small inconsistencies in timelines, probing into the last arguments, the last text messages, the last known phone activity. The family sensed the shift in tone. Where once they were treated as victims, they now felt like subjects of suspicion. Each interview carried an undercurrent of accusation, as if officers were searching not just for a missing girl, but for cracks in the family's story. Her father grew defensive, her mother hysterical. It was a cruel new layer of pain on top of the unthinkable loss already unfolding. Yet, none of it produced answers. Days bled into a week, the search effort slowly scaling back as fatigue and futility set in. What had begun with helicopters and search dogs was reduced to smaller patrols and scattered tips. The community's energy began to wane, though fear lingered in every household. Parents kept children indoors, locked doors earlier, and eyed strangers warily. The once ordinary act of walking a dog along the trail was now laced with dread. Still, the girl was gone. No footprints, no clothing, no phone, no body. Just an absence that seemed to expand with each hour. And as the official search began to lose momentum, one haunting realization echoed louder with every passing day. Whatever happened in those first hours would determine whether she would ever be found. When the first frantic days of searching turned up nothing, investigators shifted their focus. They had combed the woods, drained sections of the creek, interviewed neighbors, and logged every tip that came in. And still, there was no evidence the girl had ever left the trail on her own. With each fruitless search, attention began to move closer to home. In cases like this, investigators often looked first at those nearest to the victim. It was not because they believed the family guilty, but because statistically, the answers to a disappearance were often found within the household. The father was the first to be scrutinized. He had told detectives he returned late from work that evening, but coworkers painted a muddier picture of his timeline. Some remembered seeing him leave earlier than he claimed, while others couldn't place him at all. Detectives pressed for receipts, time cards, phone records. He produced some, but the gaps in his story persisted. It was enough to raise eyebrows, and soon the whispers in town grew louder. People wondered if tension in the marriage had spilled over, if perhaps an argument with his daughter had ended in tragedy. The family denied it, insisting he was a dedicated parent who had never raised a hand in anger. But suspicion, once ignited, was hard to extinguish. Attention then turned to the girl's younger brother. He was only 13, still a child, but detectives noted inconsistencies in his recounting of that night. At first, he said he was in his room playing video games the whole evening. Later, he admitted he had gone outside briefly to meet a friend at the end of the street. When asked again, his timeline shifted once more. Detectives wondered if he was hiding something or if the trauma of the moment had simply scrambled his memory. The boy became withdrawn, avoiding eye contact, answering in clipped sentences. To investigators, it felt like deflection. To his family, it was the behavior of a scared teenager overwhelmed by the scrutiny suddenly surrounding him. Even the girl's mother came under quiet suspicion. Neighbors recalled heated arguments between mother and daughter in the weeks before the disappearance, typical clashes between parent and teenager. but now recast under a darker light. Detectives asked if the arguments had ever turned physical, if the mother had perhaps snapped in frustration. She insisted no, that they had disagreed about curfews, friends, and schoolwork. Nothing unusual. Still, the tension became another seed of doubt in the growing field of speculation. For the family, these suspicions felt like betrayal. They had opened their home to investigators, handed over phones, computers, journals, anything that might help. Yet the questions became sharper, less about strangers and more about what might have happened inside the walls of their own house. Friends who once gathered in support began to step back, uncertain how much they could trust what they thought they knew. Even the church community that had rallied in prayer began to fracture, some whispering that there had to be more to the story. The community's need for answers became a double-edged blade. Without evidence pointing outward, suspicion turned inward, cutting into the very people already broken by loss. The parents grew defensive, angry at reporters who asked if their daughter had run away, devastated at neighbors who speculated about hidden violence. Their son withdrew further, struggling with the weight of being seen as both grieving sibling and potential witness to something darker. Investigators, meanwhile, pursued every angle. They checked the father's financial records for unusual spending, his phone logs for suspicious calls. They examined the mother's work schedule, her alibis, her emails. They pulled the brother's internet history, combing for signs of contact with anyone suspicious. None of it yielded the kind of breakthrough they needed. There were no deleted messages hinting at secret lives, no receipts for cleaning supplies or late-night drives, no hidden bank withdrawals. The family's story, while imperfect, held together. And still, the absence of outside leads made them uneasy. It was easier, in some ways, to imagine the explanation lay within the family, however painful that possibility might be. Each time detectives gathered to review the case, the same questions circled back. Why had the dog been found alone? Why had there been no trace of her in the woods? Why had the scent trail evaporated so suddenly? Theories multiplied, but hard evidence refused to surface. Outside the investigation, gossip tore through the community. Some said the father's long hours weren't spent at work but with another woman, that perhaps his daughter had discovered something she shouldn't have. Others whispered that the brother's behavior had always been odd, that maybe jealousy or resentment had boiled over. A few even turned their suspicion toward the mother, remembering her short temper at school meetings, the sharpness in her voice when correcting her children in public. What had once been a supportive town became divided by rumors, each family choosing which version of the story they believed. The parents felt the shift acutely. They noticed fewer neighbors stopping by, fewer friends willing to volunteer in the searches. Reporters camped outside their house, less for updates and more for scandal, probing for cracks they could expose. The girl's mother stopped answering the phone, exhausted by the constant cycle of interrogation and innuendo. Her father threw himself into the search, desperate to prove his innocence by finding the real explanation. Their son retreated into silence, his grief twisted by the suspicion surrounding him. But for all the rumors, for all the questions pointed inward, nothing tangible ever emerged. No hidden evidence, no confession, no slip that revealed guilt. The family, battered and isolated, remained exactly what they claimed to be. People waiting for a daughter and sister who had walked into the evening and never returned. The absence of proof, however, did not heal the wound. Instead, it left the investigation in limbo, caught between suspicion and uncertainty. And with every day that passed, the chance of finding her alive diminished, leaving detectives torn between chasing weak leads outside and pushing harder on the fragile family inside. It was a stalemate that no one wanted to admit, but one that threatened to consume the case entirely. And while the investigators struggled with their doubts, the community grew restless, desperate for something concrete. It was in this atmosphere of suspicion and frustration that the next wave of leads began to surface. Sightings, rumors, and claims that promised direction, but in time would only add more confusion to an already fractured story. With the family under quiet suspicion, but no evidence to support an accusation, investigators widened their net. The case had become a headline in the region, and with that attention came a flood of calls. Each one carried the possibility of hope. Each one also carried the risk of distraction. The first wave of tips focused on sightings. A cashier at a gas station 10 miles away swore she had seen a teenage girl matching the missing girl's description, buying a soda late at night, accompanied by an older man. Investigators pulled surveillance footage only to discover the girl in question was a stranger passing through town with her father. Another caller reported a girl boarding a Greyhound bus at the city terminal, carrying a backpack and keeping her face hidden beneath a hood. Detectives rushed to interview staff and pull ticket records. The passenger turned out to be a runaway from another county, already accounted for by her family. Other tips were more unsettling. One man reported seeing someone dragging a large duffel bag into the woods near the trail the same night the girl vanished. Detectives descended on the area, combing through underbrush, digging shallow patches of disturbed soil. Nothing turned up. It was as if the ground itself swallowed their efforts. The tipster later admitted he wasn't even sure about the date. He might have seen the bag weeks earlier. With every new lead, the emotional whiplash grew sharper for the family. They clung to the first moments of possibility, only to be crushed when each sighting dissolved into irrelevance. The girl's mother described the cycle as torture, her heart racing at the thought her daughter might still be alive, then collapsing, with despair when she realized it was another dead end. Her father became increasingly frustrated with the investigation, questioning whether police were chasing phantoms instead of focusing on what was already known. The media amplified each rumor. Local news crews stationed vans outside the family home, and national outlets picked up the story of the girl who had walked her dog and never returned. Headlines framed her case as part of a disturbing trend of teenagers disappearing without explanation. Reporters highlighted the lack of evidence, the silence of the trial, and the helplessness of the police. It sold papers and drew viewers. But for the family, it was another invasion. Their grief and confusion were broadcast to millions, dissected by strangers who debated online whether the girl had run away, been abducted, or harmed by someone she trusted. Detectives worked tirelessly, following up on each claim despite the low odds. They checked security footage from highways, questioned truck drivers, sifted through bus manifests. A tip about a girl seen at a shopping mall led to hours of reviewing grainy footage of teenagers walking in and out of stores. Another about a girl staying at a roadside motel sent officers knocking on doors, only to find traveling families or couples on vacation. Each time, the hope that this lead might be the one to break the case dwindled further. Behind the scenes, frustration mounted. Detectives vented that for every credible tip, there were 10 that wasted valuable time. Some callers seemed sincere but mistaken. Others appeared motivated by attention, and a few were malicious, offering false leads to insert themselves into the case. The noise threatened to drown out the faint signal of anything real. Yet investigators couldn't afford to dismiss even the most unlikely stories. If they ignored one that later proved genuine, the consequences would be irreversible. The community's patience began to fray. Candlelight vigils and prayer circles gave way to quiet exhaustion. Parents still told their children not to walk the trail, but the initial urgency of the search had dulled. People needed to return to work, to school, to their routines. Only the family continued living in the suspended reality where every hour without their daughter felt like a lifetime. They kept her room untouched, the bed neatly made, her shoes lined against the wall as though she might walk back through the door at any moment. Detectives faced a troubling paradox. The more time passed, the more tips came in, yet the likelihood of any being accurate decreased. Leads stretched farther from town, claiming she had been seen in other states, even across the border. Each was logged, some investigated, most filed away as improbable. Still, the phone kept ringing. The trail itself offered nothing new. Weeks after the disappearance, officers returned with cadaver dogs, hoping the decomposition sense might reveal what earlier searches missed. The dogs again showed brief interest near the creek bend, then faltered. No bones, no clothing, no evidence surfaced. To the investigators, It was as though the trail had swallowed her whole and refused to give her back. The pressure from media and community expectations pushed detectives to keep answering the same questions with no better answers. Was it foul play? Was she alive? Had she chosen to disappear? Each time they admitted they didn't know, the frustration deepened. The case that had once been fresh and urgent began to stagnate under the weight of too many false trails. For the family, the silence was unbearable. Every newscast seemed to portray their daughter as a mystery to be solved rather than a person who had been loved and lost. Every rumor painted them in darker shades. Perhaps she had been unhappy at home. Perhaps they knew more than they admitted. They denied it all, but in the absence of answers, suspicion and speculation filled the void. Months after the disappearance, the search had grown into a tangle of false leads, exhausted resources, and a family still left with nothing. Detectives began to scale back operations, redirecting manpower to other cases. The trail that once swarmed with searchers fell silent again, the woods returning to their quiet state as though nothing had ever happened. But silence didn't mean closure. For the family, each dead end carved deeper scars, and for investigators, the lack of progress gnawed at their sense of purpose. Everyone involved understood an uncomfortable truth. Without a breakthrough, the case would slowly fade into the background, filed among the unsolved. And as time slipped away, the faint hope of finding her alive grew dimmer, leaving only one haunting question hanging over the town. If she wasn't on the trail, and she wasn't out there living another life, then where could she possibly be? Months slipped into years, and what had begun as a frantic community-wide search gradually narrowed into the quiet persistence of a grieving family. The helicopters, the search parties, and the television crews faded, but inside the home where her absence was felt every second, the hunt for answers never stopped. Her parents clung to hope with a determination that at first inspired admiration, then pity, and finally worry. They were not people living normal lives anymore. They were people orbiting around a void. They printed flyers in bulk, papering telephone poles and gas stations, even as the pages curled under rain and sun. Each time they ordered a new batch, the photo of their daughter became more dated, her smile frozen at 15 while the world aged without her. Her mother attended every candlelight vigil she could organize, standing in front of crowds, her voice breaking as she begged anyone with information to come forward. Her father, less prone to public displays, worked the quieter angles, calling police departments in other states, mailing packets of information to organizations that tracked missing children, leaving voicemails for private investigators he could barely afford to hire. The financial strain crept in early. The cost of searches, billboards, and private help piled onto the everyday weight of a mortgage and bills. Credit cards maxed out. Vacations disappeared, savings drained. Friends who had once donated to help with costs moved on with their own lives, unable to carry the family's burden indefinitely. The father picked up overtime shifts when he could. The mother took part-time work despite her declining health, but the hole in their finances grew larger. By the third year, the family was on the brink of ruin, yet neither parent could bring themselves to stop spending money on the search. To stop was to admit defeat, and neither was willing to give up on their daughter. The strain on their marriage became impossible to ignore. The smallest disagreements escalated into hours of silence or days of bitterness. The father accused the mother of obsessing to the point of madness, of neglecting their son in her crusade. The mother accused him of not caring enough, of being too willing to accept their daughter was gone. They fought in whispers at night, in harsh words that echoed through thin walls, while their surviving child sat alone in his room listening. For the younger brother, the disappearance defined his adolescence. He carried a private guilt, convinced that if he had gone with her that evening, she might still be alive. He replayed the decision over and over, the moment he said no to walking the dog with her, choosing video games instead. That choice became an anchor tied around his neck. At first, he internalized it, slipping into silence at school, withdrawing from friends. Then, as the years passed, the guilt twisted into rebellion. He began skipping classes, hanging out with older kids, and testing the limits of authority. Teachers described him as distracted, angry, and sometimes reckless. Neighbors saw a boy haunted by a shadow he couldn't escape. His parents, consumed by their own grief, often failed to intervene until it was too late. They missed the signs, missed the late-night outings, missed the quiet despair behind the anger. To them, he was still a child they needed to protect, but he saw himself as the forgotten one, the sibling who survived but could never measure up to the memory of the one who was lost. The home grew colder, filled less with conversation and more with the sound of doors shutting, arguments simmering, and silence stretching long into the night. Meanwhile, the official investigation slowed to a near halt. Detectives rotated to other cases, the command post was dismantled, and the binders of files were shelved among hundreds of other cold cases. Periodically, a new detective would take a fresh look, skim the reports, and make a few calls. Each time, the result was the same: no new evidence, no new witnesses, no forward motion. To the system, the girl became another unresolved statistic. To her family, she remained everything. Her mother's obsession deepened. She joined online forums for families of missing children, trading stories with strangers who knew her pain. She read about forensics, about unsolved crimes, about predators who had hidden in plain sight. At night, she drove the streets, sometimes parking near the trail where her daughter vanished, staring into the darkness as though sheer will might force an answer to appear. Her father tried to keep the family afloat, working long hours, but he too was trapped. He would sit at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring at maps of the area, tracing routes with his finger, whispering to himself that there had to be something they missed. The years left scars not only on their finances and relationships, but on their very sense of reality. Birthdays passed with empty chairs. Holidays felt like performances, traditions carried out in the shadow of what was missing. Each milestone deepened the wound. She would have turned 16, then 18, then 21. Each year they imagined what she would have looked like, what she would have become, how different their lives would be if only she had come home from that walk. By the 5th year, the community had largely moved on. New families moved into the neighborhood, new children played on the sidewalks, new tragedies claimed attention. But for the girl's family, time stopped the night she disappeared. They could not leave the house, could not change her room, could not move forward. Her brother spoke openly about leaving once he was old enough, desperate to escape the weight of living inside a memorial. Despite everything, the family clung to hope. It was fragile, sometimes desperate, but it was the only thing keeping them from collapsing completely. They told themselves that people had been found alive after years missing. They pointed to rare cases where survivors returned home, older but alive. They convinced themselves that one day their phone might ring with the news they had been waiting for. But as the years stretched on, that hope hardened into something else, an obsession that consumed every waking moment, a grief that calcified and refused to let go. They were no longer simply a family waiting for answers. They had become a family defined by the absence of one girl, trapped in the long shadow of a mystery that refused to fade. And in that silence, in that endless waiting, the case itself slipped into cold obscurity, setting the stage for the chilling discovery that would not come until more than a decade later. As the years stretched on, the trail where the girl vanished shifted from a place of daily routine into something altogether different. Once used by joggers, families, and children on bicycles, it became a place people avoided unless they had no choice. The wooden sign at its entrance faded and peeled, the path overgrown in sections where it had once been kept clear. Locals began to describe it with unease, whispering that the woods had taken something from them and never given it back. Stories began to circulate. Teenagers, daring one another late at night, would creep down the trail with flashlights, swearing they heard branches snap behind them, though no one followed. Some claimed that on quiet evenings, when the wind carried just right, they could hear a dog barking faintly in the distance, though no dogs were ever found. The creek bend, where the scent trail had once gone cold, became a point of fascination. Kids called it cursed, convinced that if you lingered there too long, you might vanish too. What began as fear grew into folklore, another layer added to the collective memory of a tragedy that never found its ending. For her family, that silence was heavier than any rumor. The trail remained the last place she was seen alive, and so her mother visited often, parking nearby and walking only part of the way, standing at the edge as though afraid to step deeper. She would sit on the hood of her car for hours, staring into the shadows, hoping for some sign, some overlooked clue. Her father went less often, but when he did, he brought maps, convinced there was still a possibility the search had missed something buried deep in the undergrowth. They never stopped returning to that place, even as the years made it harder each time. Detectives rotated over the years, new faces assigned to review old cases. Each time, the binders of reports and evidence were pulled down from the shelves, and someone would spend weeks reading through the transcripts, interviews, and timelines. And each time, they ended where the last detective had, staring at a case with no movement, no evidence, no trail to follow. Some tried to shake it loose with fresh interviews, but neighbors had moved, memories had faded, and new families in the area knew only the story, not the girl. It was as if the case had aged out of the world it belonged to. Occasionally, a tip would jolt the investigation back into the spotlight. A driver swore he had seen a girl matching her description in another state. A hiker reported finding scraps of clothing deep in the woods. Each was examined, and each collapsed under scrutiny. The girl remained missing, her file thick with unanswered questions. In time, detectives admitted quietly what they wouldn't say to the family, that without new evidence, the case would remain cold. The community carried its own quiet guilt. Parents who had once walked their children down that trail avoided it altogether. The annual memorials, once crowded, grew smaller. People didn't want to be reminded. They said the woods held bad energy, that nothing good could come from going there. Yet still the story lingered, shaping the identity of the town. For outsiders, it was a place known for a disappearance. For those who lived there, it was a wound that never closed. The girl's brother grew older under the weight of the unsolved case. In high school, he refused to participate in projects about local history, knowing that classmates would bring up his sister. He avoided the trail, avoided conversations, avoided the constant sideways glances of people who still wondered what his family might be hiding. By the time he left for college, he vowed never to come back. But even miles away, he admitted he felt tied to the silence of the woods, as if the trail followed him wherever he went. Her mother, meanwhile, never stopped speaking her name. She joined every missing persons network she could, sharing photos online, attending vigils for strangers, and clinging to the hope that one day her daughter would be found. Her father grew quieter, burying himself in work and refusing to talk about the case unless pressed. Their marriage existed in fragments, two people united only by grief and separated by how differently they carried it. The trail itself bore no signs of what had happened. No bones surfaced, no clothing was unearthed, no evidence of a struggle revealed itself. The silence was maddening for investigators, who often said cases like this at least left behind a trace. Here, there was nothing. A girl had walked in, and the woods had closed around her without a sound. For those who believed in omens, the trail became a place of dread. Some locals stopped letting their children walk dogs or ride bikes anywhere near it. Real estate agents had to reassure new buyers that the neighborhood was safe, though they knew the story would surface eventually. Hikers reported an uneasy feeling when passing through, as though watched. Rational minds dismissed it as superstition, yet few could explain why the place felt heavier than it should, why the air seemed thicker. The case, unsolved and untouched, became another burden in the long list of disappearances across the country. But unlike many, this one carried the weight of proximity. Everyone in town knew someone who had known her. Teachers kept her yearbook photo on their shelves. Friends who had grown up moved away but never forgot the night she vanished. It was not just the loss of one girl. It was the slow erosion of a community's trust in the ordinary. By the 10th year, the trail had become a symbol of silence. The girl's parents no longer believed she would walk back through the door, but they still clung to the idea that her remains might be found. that the story might have an ending. What they could not know, what no one could predict, was that nature itself would soon intervene, that a storm would tear through the woods, uprooting the silence that had held for more than a decade and expose what had been hidden all along. 11 years passed before nature itself broke the silence. It happened in late spring, when a violent storm rolled across the region with a force few could remember. Winds tore through the county, uprooting century-old trees and snapping power lines like twigs. Rain hammered the ground for hours, overwhelming drainage systems and swelling the creeks until they spilled out across the low-lying trails. Homes lost shingles, roads were blocked by fallen branches, and for days afterward, crews worked to restore power to thousands. For most, it was an inconvenience. For one family, it was the beginning of an answer they had thought might never come. The trail where the girl vanished had taken the brunt of the storm. Trees that had stood tall since before the neighborhood was built now lay toppled across the paths, their roots yanked from the earth, leaving gaping cavities in the soil. The creek surged beyond its banks, washing away sections of land and leaving behind jagged scars where water had torn through. The place already carried a reputation as cursed, and now it looked like something torn open by force. For nearly 2 weeks the area was closed, marked off as unsafe. But hikers, drawn by curiosity and the urge to see the damage, began wandering the edges once the water receded. It was one of those hikers who saw it first, at the base of a tree ripped clean from the ground, where roots jutted upward in a tangled snarl. Something unnatural clung to the exposed soil. At first glance, it looked like fabric, faded and brittle, caught in the roots like debris carried by floodwater. But when the hiker stepped closer, they noticed the texture. Torn cloth with stitching that didn't match modern outdoor gear. They bent down, brushing away mud, and realized it wasn't just fabric. Tangled in the roots was a scrap of clothing, faded but unmistakably human. Nearby, where the creek had cut through a section of bank, another discovery waited. The soil had collapsed inward, revealing what had been buried beneath for more than a decade. The hiker froze at the sight, shapes protruding from the earth that were not wood or stone, a curve of bone, pale against the dark mud, the form of a shoe, rotted but still identifiable. The horror of what they were looking at struck all at once. They backed away, hands trembling, and dialed emergency services. When deputies arrived, they quickly secured the area, pushing back onlookers and marking the site with tape. Word spread faster than they could contain it. Within hours, reporters who hadn't covered the case in years were racing to the scene. Residents whispered the same thing to each other. After 11 years, the woods had finally given something back. The girl's family received the call they had both dreaded and begged for. Detectives asked them to come to the station, explaining only that items had been found near the trail. Her parents knew immediately what that meant. Her mother collapsed into tears before she could even put on her coat. Her father sat in silence during the drive, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. They had longed for answers, but the reality of remains being uncovered carried a finality that neither of them was ready to accept. At the site, forensic teams began the careful work of recovery. They erected tents to shield the area, photographing every angle, marking every item before it was moved. The fabric was collected, bagged, and sent to the lab. The bones were lifted delicately from the soil, fragments of a body that had been hidden for more than a decade. Items were cataloged: rusted metal, a decayed shoe sole, scraps of cloth. Investigators spoke in hushed tones, aware that the discovery was not only significant for the case, but devastating for the family who had waited so long. The sheriff gave a brief statement to the press that evening. He confirmed that human remains had been located near the trail, and while identification would take time, the proximity to where the girl had disappeared was not lost on anyone. Reporters swarmed for details, but little more was given. Behind closed doors, detectives already suspected what the evidence would confirm, that after 11 years of silence, the girl had been found. The town reacted with a mix of relief and horror. For years, the disappearance had hung over the community like a shadow. Now, the possibility of resolution came with the grim truth that she had been there all along, buried in the soil they had walked past countless times. Parents hugged their children tighter. Neighbors exchanged looks of disbelief. Conversations in grocery stores and church parking lots revolved around the same stunned refrain. How could she have been so close without anyone knowing? For the family, the discovery cracked open every wound that time had dulled but never healed. They had lived in the uncertainty of not knowing, clinging to the faint hope that their daughter might be alive somewhere. Now that hope was gone, replaced by a grief that was certain and final. Yet beneath the devastation was another feeling, demand for answers. How had her body ended up beneath the soil near the trail? Was it an accident, or had someone placed her there deliberately? Detectives knew the storm had changed everything. The woods had held their secret for more than a decade, but now the elements had forced it into the open. The case, long dormant, was alive again, and with it came the possibility of finally understanding what had happened on that ordinary evening 11 years earlier. But the remains were only the beginning. The truth, buried deep in the soil of the trail, still waited to be unearthed. In the days after the storm unearthed the fragments of bone and cloth, the trail was transformed from a place of silence into a controlled crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across the entrances, deputies stood guard at every access point, and teams of forensic specialists moved deliberately through the mud, documenting every detail. What they uncovered was not only human remains, but the long-buried truth of what had happened all those years earlier. The bones were fragile, fractured by years underground, yet still intact enough to piece together. Forensic anthropologists laid them out carefully, cataloging each fragment. Alongside the skeletal remains were personal effects: a torn hoodie sleeve, scraps of denim, a sneaker sole. Each was bagged and labeled, every fiber a possible key to understanding. Detectives knew the family would need absolute certainty before they could accept what had been found, and so DNA testing was rushed. Within a week, the results confirmed what everyone already suspected. The remains belonged to the missing girl who had vanished on her walk 11 years earlier. But the question remained: how had she ended up buried beneath the trail? The soil told part of the story. Forensic geologists determined that flooding had eroded layers of earth that had previously concealed her. The position of the bones suggested she had not been laid to rest in a deliberate grave, but rather pulled into a low-lying channel near the creek, covered over time by silt and roots. Investigators shifted their focus to the drainage system that ran beneath parts of the trail, remnants of an old stormwater network installed decades earlier when the neighborhood was first developed. Engineers were called in to examine the infrastructure. What they found was both chilling and illuminating. Several of the drains had been constructed with outdated suction systems, powerful enough to trap debris, and, under the right circumstances, even a human body. The drains funneled into narrow channels, creating pockets where water pressure could pin and hold an object in place indefinitely. It was a design flaw, long since outlawed in newer systems, but here it had remained, unnoticed. When investigators ran simulations, the results were stark. A person could be pulled under during flooding and held against the grate, or lodged in a recess, effectively hidden from sight. The flow of water and accumulating debris would seal the body in, preventing it from resurfacing or drifting downstream. To searchers, it would have appeared as though the creek was empty. No one would have thought to dismantle the system in those frantic early days. The autopsy report added the final piece. Despite the years that had passed, the medical examiner was able to confirm signs of drowning. There were no fractures consistent with assault, no evidence of blunt trauma, no indications of restraint or foul play. The conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. She had fallen victim to a tragic accident, her body caught and concealed by a faulty drainage system that kept her hidden for over a decade. For the detectives who had worked the case, the realization was gutting. They had scoured those woods, dragged that very creek, and searched with dogs and divers. Yet the girl had been there all along, trapped where no one could see. The mystery that had haunted the community had not been the work of a predator or a runaway, but of mechanics in water, an accident camouflaged as something sinister. When the findings were released, residents were stunned. For years, they had whispered theories of abduction, stalkers, and hidden dangers lurking in their neighborhood. Now they were told the truth was a broken piece of infrastructure, a hazard so mundane it seemed impossible it could have caused so much suffering. Parents who had once forbidden their children from walking the trail out of fear of strangers now felt betrayed by something far less visible, a mechanical failure that had masqueraded as a human crime. The family received the news with a mix of devastation and relief. They finally had answers, but those answers reopened every wound. The idea that their daughter's death had been preventable, that she had been within reach all those years, was unbearable. Her mother wept at the thought of all the nights spent staring at the creek, never realizing her child was trapped just below the surface. Her father, long hardened by years of disappointment, broke down when he saw the autopsy report. They had searched everywhere, but the place that held their daughter had been invisible. Engineers explained to the public how such drains had once been common and how they had been known to pose risks of entrapment. In swimming pools, similar systems had been outlawed after a string of child drownings. Yet here, buried beneath a wooded trail, the danger had gone unnoticed for decades. It was a hidden threat no one had thought to connect to a missing person case, and in that oversight, a tragedy had been sealed. The town council faced angry questions. Why had the drainage system never been inspected? Why had it taken a storm to expose the truth? Officials promised reforms, audits of every old structure, and immediate updates to prevent anything like this from happening again. But those promises felt hollow to a family who had lost everything. No repair or policy could undo 11 years of torment, suspicion, and grief. For the community, the revelation was horrifying in its ordinariness. They had wanted a villain, a dark figure to explain the disappearance. Instead, the culprit was rust, water, and poor engineering. The forest's silence had not been a conspiracy, but the quiet persistence of mechanical failure, hiding tragedy in plain sight. Yet even in closure, unease lingered. If something so small could erase a child from the world for over a decade, how many other mysteries might be nothing more than accidents disguised as disappearances? The answer brought resolution, but also a new kind of fear, the fear of what else could be hidden, waiting silently for time and nature to reveal. What at first looked like the tragic conclusion to an accident began to shift when investigators returned for a deeper forensic sweep. The storm had not only unearthed bones, but also loosened soil far beyond the initial site. As forensic teams widened their excavation, they found evidence that told a much darker story than anyone had expected. Among the girl's remains, technicians discovered rope fibers embedded in the decayed fabric of her clothing. At first, they thought the strands were plant material carried by the flood, but under microscopic analysis, they were revealed to be synthetic, remnants of a cord strong enough to bind. The placement suggested they had once been around her wrists or ankles. The medical examiner, reviewing the skull more closely, noted fractures inconsistent with drowning or entrapment. The marks bore the unmistakable signs of blunt force trauma, injuries that would have occurred before death. Whatever had happened to her, it was not the silent drowning of an accident. It was violent. As soil samples and debris were sifted, the discoveries grew more chilling. A rusted belt buckle and fragments of fabric were uncovered several feet away, items that did not match the missing girl's clothing but belonged to another case file. A teenage boy reported missing from the county 4 years earlier. His disappearance had gone largely unnoticed beyond his immediate circle, a runaway to some, a mystery to others. Now, his belongings were found tangled in the same earth. Detectives were forced to confront a terrifying realization. This was no hidden drainage accident. The wooded trail had served another purpose entirely. It had been a dumping ground. For years, evidence of multiple disappearances had been buried beneath the surface, concealed not by chance, but by someone who knew the terrain and counted on the silence of the forest to hide their crimes. The case that had seemed resolved was ripped open once again, shifting from tragedy to horror. And as investigators pieced together the pattern, one question burned through every conversation: who had been using the trail as a graveyard, and how had they managed to escape suspicion for more than a decade? As detectives followed the new evidence, the investigation took a turn few in the community could have anticipated. The rope fibers, the blunt force trauma, the belongings of another missing teenager, all of it pointed not to chance, but to intent. Files were reopened, names cross-referenced, and soon one stood out: a man who had lived less than half a mile from the trail at the time of the girl's disappearance. He had been a park maintenance worker, a solitary figure who kept odd hours and knew the terrain better than anyone. He died of natural causes 6 years earlier, his passing barely noticed, his name remembered by only a handful of former colleagues. At the time, no one had connected him to the missing girl. But now, investigators returned to the property he had once occupied. What they found there left little doubt. In an abandoned shed behind the overgrown house were boxes of journals meticulously kept. Inside were pages of rambling entries about watching the trail, about encounters with wanderers who strayed too far from home. More disturbing still were keepsakes: hair, ribbons, jewelry, scraps of clothing that matched items from unsolved cases. Among them was a bracelet identical to one the missing girl's mother had described her daughter wearing the night she vanished. The realization settled heavily over the investigation. The man had been hiding in plain sight, trusted with maintaining the very woods that concealed his crimes. He had lived alone, left few traces, and when he died, the secrets of what he had done were buried with him. Only the storm, years later, had ripped them into the open. For the community, the revelation was shattering. Parents who had once told their children to fear strangers from outside learned that the true danger had been a neighbor, a man hired to keep the park safe. For the family, it was both closure and heartbreak. They finally knew who had taken their daughter, but the knowledge came too late for justice. There would be no trial, no confession, no chance to confront him. Still, the truth mattered. After 11 years of silence, the mystery was resolved. The girl had not simply vanished. She had been hidden by a predator who lived among them, unnoticed until nature forced his secret to the surface.